Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed pages crackled beneath Dr. Margaret Whitmore's careful fingers as she navigated through the dusty archives of the Virginia Historical Society on that humid September morning in 1987. What had begun as routine research into early 19th century domestic life in rural Virginia would soon evolve into something far more disturbing than any academic pursuit warranted. The document that captured her attention bore the official seal of Henrico County, dated March 15th, 1811, written in the precise hand of County Clerk Josiah Pemberton. It detailed the investigation into what local authorities had termed the most peculiar and distressing circumstances surrounding the demise of several prominent citizens of our community. The report, filed away and seemingly forgotten for over a century, would prove to be the first thread in unraveling one of Virginia's most enigmatic tragedies. According to Pemberton's meticulous records, the investigation centered around Mrs. Abigail Frost, a widow of 34 years who had resided in the remote Blackwater Valley region since her husband's death from consumption 3 years prior. The clerk's initial description painted her as a woman of unremarkable appearance and gentle disposition, known throughout the valley for her charitable nature and exceptional culinary skills. Neighbors frequently sought her assistance during times of illness, and her preserves and baked goods were considered the finest in the county. The events that would forever alter the perception of Mrs. Frost began on the evening of February 28, 1811, when she extended invitations to 6 of the valley's most respected families for what she described as a feast of gratitude for the kindness shown during my period of mourning. The invitation, written in her characteristic flowing script, promised an evening of fellowship and her renowned cooking, specifically mentioning a special preparation she had been perfecting throughout the winter months. Dr. Whitmore paused in her reading, noting the peculiar formality of the language used in the surviving invitation, which had been preserved as evidence. There was something unsettling in the precise wording, a subtle undertone that seemed to suggest deeper meaning beneath the surface courtesy. The phrase, "feast of gratitude," appeared repeatedly throughout the correspondence, always emphasized with particular care in the penmanship. The guest list, as recorded by Clerk Pemberton, included the most prominent families of the Blackwater Valley, the Ashfords, who owned the largest tobacco plantation in the region, the Weatherbys, whose mill provided flour for most of the county, the Caldwells, respected merchants who controlled much of the local trade, the Thorntons, whose patriarch served as the valley's unofficial magistrate, the Bishops, whose medical practice served the scattered rural population, and the Morlands, whose family had been among the first settlers in the area. Each family had accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, according to the testimonies later collected by the authorities. Mrs. Frost's reputation as a hostess was well established, and her gatherings were considered among the most pleasant social events in their isolated community. The winter of 1810 to 1811 had been particularly harsh, with heavy snows isolating many families for weeks at a time, making the prospect of company and fine food especially appealing. The preparations for the evening, as described by various witnesses, had been extensive. Mrs. Frost had spent the better part of a week acquiring ingredients from various sources throughout the county. She had requested specific items from the Weatherby mill, particular cuts of meat from local farmers, and had even sent word to Richmond for certain exotic spices and seasonings unavailable in the rural valley. Her dedication to creating a memorable meal was noted by several merchants who had dealings with her during this period. Dr. Whitmore found herself increasingly absorbed by the methodical nature of Clerk Pemberton's documentation. His attention to detail revealed a man who understood the gravity of what he was recording, Yet the clinical tone of his writing suggested an attempt to maintain professional distance from events that clearly disturbed him deeply. Between the lines of official language, she could sense his struggle to comprehend what had transpired in that isolated farmhouse. The widow's property, as described in the surveyor's notes attached to the file, sat at the end of a winding dirt road that branched off from the main thoroughfare connecting the valley to Richmond. Surrounded by dense woodland and positioned near the banks of a slow-moving creek, the house enjoyed both privacy and natural beauty. The isolation that had once provided peaceful solitude would soon become a crucial element in the tragedy that unfolded. As Dr. Whitmore prepared to turn to the next section of the report, she noticed that Clerk Pemberton had included a personal notation in the margin. "May God grant that such darkness never again visit our peaceful valley." The tremor in his usually steady handwriting suggested that even the act of recording these events had left its mark upon the man tasked with preserving them for posterity. The second section of Clerk Pemberton's report drew heavily from the testimony of Samuel Hartwell, a traveling merchant who had arrived in Blackwater Valley on the morning of March 1st, 1811. Hartwell's account, recorded 3 days after the events, provided the most comprehensive external perspective of what transpired at the Frost residence on that fateful February evening. According to Hartwell's sworn statement, he had approached Mrs. Frost's property shortly after sunset, seeking shelter for the night, as was customary for travelers in the sparsely populated region. The sight that greeted him as he rounded the final bend in the dirt road would remain etched in his memory for the remainder of his days. 6 carriages stood arranged in the yard before the modest farmhouse, their horses still harnessed but standing unnaturally still in the gathering darkness. The merchant noted the peculiar silence that enveloped the property. Despite the obvious presence of guests indicated by the multiple conveyances, no sounds of conversation or merriment emanated from within the house. The windows glowed with warm lamplight, casting rectangular patches of yellow across the snow-covered ground, yet the scene possessed a quality that Hartwell struggled to articulate in his testimony. He described it as a tableau of normalcy that felt profoundly wrong, as though nature itself held its breath in anticipation of some terrible revelation. Hartwell's initial assumption was that he had arrived during a moment of prayer, or perhaps a solemn toast, explaining the unusual quiet. He approached the front door with the intention of requesting accommodation in the barn or stable, as was common practice among the hospitable residents of the valley. His first knock received no response, nor did his second, delivered with greater force and accompanied by a polite announcement of his presence. The merchant's testimony revealed his growing unease as he circled the house, peering through windows in an attempt to locate the occupants. Through the dining room window, he observed a scene that initially appeared perfectly ordinary. A long table set with fine china and crystal, chairs positioned as though guests had recently been seated, and the remnants of what appeared to have been an elaborate meal. Candles burned steadily in their holders, and the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the walls. Yet something in the arrangement troubled Hartwell, though he could not immediately identify the source of his discomfort. The chairs, he noted, were pushed back from the table at odd angles, as though the occupants had risen suddenly or perhaps fallen backward. Several wine glasses lay overturned, their contents having stained the white tablecloth in dark, irregular patterns that resembled nothing so much as dried blood in the flickering candlelight. Hartwell's account detailed his discovery of the kitchen door, which stood slightly ajar despite the February cold. Upon entering, he found evidence of extensive culinary preparation, numerous pots and pans, some still containing remnants of various dishes, and the lingering aroma of herbs and spices that seemed both appetizing and somehow unsettling. The merchant noted that many of the cooking vessels contained preparations he could not identify, despite his extensive travels and familiarity with regional cuisines. The most disturbing aspect of Hartwell's testimony concerned his discovery of Mrs. Frost herself. He found her seated in a rocking chair beside the kitchen hearth, dressed in her finest black silk gown and appearing for all the world as though she were simply resting after the completion of her hosting duties. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her expression was one of serene contentment, as though she had achieved some long-sought goal. It was only upon closer inspection that Hartwell realized Mrs. Frost was no longer among the living. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her eyes, though open, held no spark of consciousness. Most peculiar was the complete absence of any sign of distress or struggle. She appeared to have simply settled into her chair and peacefully departed from this world, a faint smile still gracing her lips. The merchant's search of the house revealed the fate of the invited guests, though Clark Pemberton's report handled these details with characteristic discretion. Each family was discovered in various locations throughout the residence, all having apparently succumbed to the same mysterious fate that had claimed their hostess. Like Mrs. Frost, they showed no signs of violence or struggle, appearing instead as though they had simply laid down to rest and never awakened. Hartwell's testimony concluded with his immediate departure to summon the authorities, a journey that required him to travel through the night to reach the county seat. His description of that desperate ride through the winter darkness conveyed the profound terror that had seized him upon making his grisly discovery. He spoke of feeling pursued by unseen forces and of hearing whispers carried on the wind, though he acknowledged these sensations might have been products of his overwrought imagination. The merchant's final observation, recorded with obvious reluctance, concerned the peculiar state of preservation in which he had found all the deceased. Despite the warmth of the house and the passage of what must have been several hours since their deaths, none showed the typical signs of mortality's advance. They appeared, in his words, as though death had touched them with the gentlest of hands, preserving them in their final moments like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, the county coroner and physician, arrived at the Frost residence on the morning of March 2nd, accompanied by Clark Pemberton and 2 deputies. Morrison's medical report, preserved in meticulous detail within the archives, provided the first scientific examination of the tragedy that had befallen the Blackwater Valley community. The physician's initial observations confirmed Hartwell's account regarding the unusual preservation of the deceased. Morrison noted in his report that despite the passage of nearly 48 hours since the estimated time of death, none of the bodies exhibited the typical signs of decomposition one would expect under normal circumstances. The absence of rigor mortis and the maintained flexibility of the limbs particularly puzzled the experienced doctor who had served as coroner for over 15 years. Morrison's examination of Mrs. Frost revealed several peculiarities that defied his medical understanding. Her skin retained a natural warmth and color, and her hair remained lustrous and well-arranged, as though she had recently completed her evening toilette. Most remarkably, her expression maintained that serene smile Hartwell had described, suggesting that whatever had caused her demise had done so without causing distress or awareness of impending doom. The physician's attempts to determine the cause of death proved frustratingly inconclusive. External examination revealed no wounds, bruises, or other signs of physical trauma. The pupils appeared normal, and there were no obvious indicators of poisoning such as discoloration of the lips or fingernails. Morrison noted that the deceased appeared to have simply ceased all vital functions simultaneously, as though some invisible force had gently extinguished the spark of life within them. The examination of the guests yielded similarly perplexing results. Each individual was discovered in a position that suggested peaceful repose rather than sudden collapse. The Ashford family had been found in the parlor, arranged as though they had been engaged in quiet conversation. The Weatherbees were discovered in the library, with the patriarch still holding an open book in his hands. The other families were positioned throughout the house in equally natural poses, creating an atmosphere of suspended animation rather than death. Morrison's report detailed his careful examination of the dining room, where the remnants of the evening's feast still adorned the table. The physician noted the exceptional quality and variety of the dishes that had been prepared, many of which contained ingredients he could not readily identify. Several preparations appeared to incorporate exotic herbs and spices that were uncommon in Virginia cuisine of the period, suggesting that Mrs. Frost had gone to considerable expense and effort to procure them. The wine glasses and serving vessels underwent particular scrutiny, as Morrison suspected that any harmful substance would most likely have been administered through food or drink. However, his examination of the remaining contents revealed nothing obviously suspicious. The wines appeared to be of excellent quality, and the various sauces and gravies showed no signs of adulteration or contamination that his limited chemical knowledge could detect. One aspect of the scene that particularly troubled the physician was the apparent timing of the deaths. Based on the positions of the bodies and the state of the meal, Morrison concluded that the guests had succumbed at different points throughout the evening. Some appeared to have been affected during the main course, while others seemed to have lasted until the serving of dessert. Mrs. Frost herself appeared to have survived the longest, having had time to clear some dishes and retire to her chair by the fire. Morrison's medical report included detailed sketches of the scene and the positioning of each victim, drawn with the precision of a man trained in anatomical illustration. These drawings, preserved alongside his written observations, captured the eerie tranquility that had settled over the house. The physician noted that even the household cat, discovered curled peacefully beside the kitchen hearth, had apparently succumbed to the same mysterious fate as its human companions. The doctor's conclusion, written with obvious reluctance and professional uncertainty, stated that while he could find no definitive cause of death, the simultaneous demise of so many individuals suggested the presence of some unknown agent. He recommended that samples of the remaining food and drink be preserved for future examination, should more advanced methods of analysis become available. Morrison's final notation in the report revealed his personal struggle with the inexplicable nature of the tragedy. He wrote that in all his years of medical practice, he had never encountered death so peaceful, yet so thoroughly mysterious, leaving him to question whether some forces in nature remained beyond the understanding of contemporary science. Following Dr. Morrison's inconclusive examination, Clark Pemberton initiated a comprehensive investigation into the background of Abigail Frost, seeking any detail that might illuminate the circumstances surrounding the tragedy. His methodical approach to gathering information would reveal a portrait of a woman whose life had been marked by a series of peculiar coincidences and unexplained events. The earliest records of Abigail Frost traced her origins to a small settlement in western Pennsylvania, where she had been born Abigail Whitmore in 1777. Parish records indicated that she was the daughter of a traveling apothecary named Cornelius Whitmore, whose reputation for healing remedies had made him both sought after and viewed with suspicion by the more conservative members of the community. Her mother, Mary Whitmore, had died during childbirth, leaving young Abigail to be raised primarily by her father and his collection of medical texts and botanical specimens. Pemberton's correspondence with officials in Pennsylvania revealed that Cornelius Whitmore had been a man of considerable learning, though his methods often strayed from conventional medical practice. Several witnesses described his extensive knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, many of which he had learned during his travels through remote regions of the frontier. The apothecary maintained detailed journals documenting various plant preparations and their effects, though these volumes had disappeared following his death in 1795. The circumstances surrounding Cornelius Whitmore's demise bore an unsettling resemblance to the recent tragedy in Virginia. According to testimony gathered by Pennsylvania authorities, the apothecary had been found dead in his laboratory, surrounded by his equipment and specimens, with no apparent cause of death. Like his daughter's victims years later, he had appeared peaceful and undisturbed, as though he had simply chosen to lay down his burdens and depart from the world. Following her father's death, 18-year-old Abigail had left Pennsylvania in the company of a traveling minister named Reverend Josiah Blackwood, who had offered to escort her to relatives in Virginia. However, Pemberton's investigation revealed that no such relatives existed, and Reverend Blackwood himself had vanished from all records shortly after their departure. The young woman had arrived in Virginia alone, carrying only a small trunk containing her personal effects and what appeared to be her father's collection of botanical notes and specimens. Abigail's marriage to Thomas Frost in 1799 had been arranged through the intercession of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a prominent widow who had taken the young woman under her protection. The marriage had been considered advantageous for both parties, as Thomas Frost was a prosperous farmer in need of a wife, while Abigail required the security and respectability that marriage provided. Contemporary accounts described the union as harmonious, though neighbors noted that Mrs. Frost maintained an unusually extensive herb garden and often prepared remedies for sick animals and occasionally for human ailments. The investigation into Thomas Frost's death in 1808 revealed another pattern of mysterious circumstances. The farmer had been in apparent good health when he retired for the evening, but was discovered the following morning by his wife, having apparently died peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Morrison, who had examined the body at the time, had attributed the death to heart failure, though he privately noted the unusual absence of any typical signs of cardiac distress. Pemberton's inquiries among the local population uncovered a series of incidents that he, when viewed collectively, painted a troubling picture of Abigail Frost's 3 years of widowhood. Several neighbors recalled occasions when sick livestock had been brought to her attention, only to be found dead the following day, though always appearing to have died without suffering. Mrs. Frost's explanations for these incidents had always been reasonable and delivered with apparent genuine distress at her inability to save the animals. More disturbing were the accounts of human visitors who had sought Mrs. Frost's assistance with various ailments. While most had recovered under her care, a few had experienced what their families described as peaceful passings shortly after consuming her preparations. In each case, the deaths had been attributed to the progression of existing illnesses, and Mrs. Frost's reputation as a caring neighbor had remained intact. The clerk's investigation also revealed that Mrs. Frost had maintained an extensive correspondence with various suppliers of rare herbs and medicinal compounds. Letters discovered in her home indicated that she had been acquiring increasingly exotic substances in the months leading up to the fatal dinner party. Several merchants in Richmond recalled her specific requests for items that were unusual even among practitioners of herbal medicine. Perhaps most significantly, Pemberton discovered that Mrs. Frost had inherited her father's journals, which contained detailed descriptions of various plant preparations and their effects on human physiology. The notebooks, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be Latin pharmaceutical terms, described numerous compounds capable of inducing states that mimicked natural death. The margins contained notes in Abigail's handwriting, suggesting that she had been studying and possibly experimenting with her father's formulations. The final piece of evidence uncovered during this phase of the investigation was a letter found among Mrs. Frost's personal effects, apparently written but never sent. In it, she expressed her gratitude to those who had shown her kindness during her period of mourning, while also revealing a deep bitterness toward what she perceived as the false nature of their sympathy and the burden of maintaining social pretenses in her isolated existence. The discovery of Cornelius Whitmore's journals in Abigail Frost's possession prompted Clark Pemberton to seek the expertise of Professor Edmund Blackthorne, a botanist from the College of William and Mary, who specialized in the medicinal properties of native and exotic plants. Professor Blackthorne's analysis of the notebooks and the specimens found in Mrs. Frost's home would provide the most compelling evidence yet regarding the nature of the tragedy. Professor Blackthorne's initial examination of the journals revealed the work of a man whose knowledge of botanical medicine far exceeded that of typical frontier apothecaries. The notebooks contained detailed descriptions of over 200 plant species, many of which were indigenous to remote regions of North America that few Europeans had explored. Each entry included precise instructions for preparation, dosage recommendations, and careful observations of effects on both animal and human subjects. The botanist noted that Cornelius Whitmore's approach to his craft demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry that was remarkably advanced for his time. The apothecary had developed methods for extracting and concentrating active compounds that would not be formally recognized by medical science for several decades. His techniques for preserving and combining various botanical preparations showed an almost intuitive grasp of principles that contemporary physicians were only beginning to comprehend. Among the most disturbing entries in the journals were detailed descriptions of what Whitmore termed peaceful transitions. These preparations, derived from a combination of rare fungi and plant alkaloids, were designed to induce a state of profound tranquility followed by the gradual cessation of vital functions. The apothecary's notes indicated that subjects who consumed these compounds experienced no distress or awareness of their approaching demise, instead entering a state of euphoric contentment that persisted until consciousness faded entirely. Professor Blackthorne's examination of the specimens found in Mrs. Frost's home confirmed that she'd been cultivating several of the plants described in her father's journals. Her greenhouse, a modest structure attached to the rear of the farmhouse, contained an impressive collection of exotic flora that would have been difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Many of the plants were native to tropical regions and required careful cultivation to survive in Virginia's climate. The botanist identified several species that were particularly significant to his investigation. Among these was a rare variety of mushroom that grew only in specific soil conditions and produced compounds capable of inducing the peaceful deaths described in Whitmore's journals. Mrs. Frost had apparently succeeded in cultivating these fungi in specially prepared beds within her greenhouse, suggesting both considerable botanical skill and deliberate intent. Professor Blackthorne's analysis of the remaining food from the fatal dinner party revealed traces of multiple plant compounds that, when combined, would have created the effects observed by Dr. Morrison. The botanist noted that the preparation of such a complex mixture would have required extensive knowledge of plant chemistry and careful attention to dosage, as the margin between the desired effect and immediate toxicity was extremely narrow. The professor's report detailed how Mrs. Frost had apparently incorporated the active compounds into various dishes throughout the meal, ensuring that each guest would consume a sufficient quantity regardless of their individual preferences. The wine had been treated with a mild sedative that would have enhanced the absorption of the other compounds, while the dessert course contained the highest concentration of the fatal preparation. Perhaps most chilling was Professor Blackthorne's discovery that Mrs. Frost had apparently consumed the same preparations as her guests, though in a carefully calculated dose that would have allowed her to survive long enough to observe the effects on her victims before succumbing herself. The botanist theorized that she had taken a preliminary dose that would have induced a state of detached euphoria, enabling her to witness the success of her plan without experiencing emotional distress. The professor's examination of Abigail's personal notes revealed that she had been experimenting with her father's formulations for several years, gradually refining the preparations and testing their effects on small animals and eventually on the sick livestock brought to her attention. Her notations demonstrated a methodical approach to perfecting the compounds, with particular attention to achieving the peaceful deaths that had become her signature. Professor Blackthorne concluded his report with the observation that Mrs. Frost had possessed knowledge that placed her decades ahead of contemporary understanding of botanical chemistry. Her ability to cultivate exotic species and prepare complex compounds suggested that she had inherited not only her father's journals, but also his intuitive understanding of the hidden properties of the plant kingdom. The botanist noted that such knowledge, in the hands of someone driven by unknown motivations, represented a form of power that few could comprehend or defend against. As Clark Pemberton's investigation deepened, he began collecting testimonies from those who had known Mrs. Frost during her years of widowhood. These accounts, gathered from neighbors, merchants, and occasional visitors to the Blackwater Valley, would gradually reveal a pattern of behavior that cast her previous acts of apparent kindness in an entirely different light. Mrs. Catherine Henley, who lived on the neighboring farm, provided perhaps the most comprehensive account of Abigail Frost's conduct during the 3 years following her husband's death. Mrs. Henley described her neighbor as a woman of impeccable manners and gentle disposition, always ready to offer assistance during times of illness or hardship. However, upon reflection prompted by recent events, Mrs. Henley began to recall subtle peculiarities in Mrs. Frost's behavior that had seemed insignificant at the time. According to Mrs. Henley's testimony, Abigail had displayed an unusual interest in the personal affairs of her neighbors, often inquiring about family disputes, financial difficulties, and social tensions within the community. These conversations, which had seemed like natural expressions of neighborly concern, now appeared to have served a more calculating purpose. Mrs. Henley recalled that Abigail had been particularly attentive to discussions of inheritance disputes, marital problems, and business rivalries among the valley's prominent families. The testimony of James Whitfield, a traveling merchant who had conducted regular business with Mrs. Frost, revealed the extent of her knowledge regarding the personal lives of her eventual victims. Whitfield recalled numerous occasions when Mrs. Frost had engaged him in conversation about the families who would later attend her fatal dinner party. She had demonstrated a remarkable awareness of their private affairs, including details about family tensions and financial arrangements that were not commonly known throughout the community. Whitfield's account also shed light on Mrs. Frost's systematic acquisition of exotic ingredients in the months preceding the tragedy. The merchant recalled her specific requests for rare spices and herbs, many of which he had been obliged to obtain through contacts in distant ports. Mrs. Frost had always paid promptly and generously for these items, though she had been deliberately vague about their intended use, claiming only that she was experimenting with new recipes for special occasions. Dr. Morrison's testimony, recorded separately from his medical report, provided insight into Mrs. Frost's interactions with the medical community. The physician recalled several occasions when she had sought his advice regarding various ailments, though her questions had often seemed more focused on understanding the mechanisms of disease and death rather than seeking treatment. Morrison noted that her knowledge of anatomy and physiology had been surprisingly sophisticated for someone without formal medical training. The doctor's account also revealed that Mrs. Frost had occasionally offered to assist with difficult cases, particularly those involving terminal illnesses. Her preparations had indeed provided comfort to suffering patients, though Morrison now realized that several individuals under her care had experienced unexpectedly peaceful deaths that had seemed almost too merciful given their previous suffering. At the time, he had attributed these outcomes to divine providence rather than human intervention. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from young Timothy Ashford, the sole surviving member of the Ashford family who had been away at school during the fatal dinner party. Timothy's account, recorded with the assistance of his guardian, revealed that his family had been experiencing significant financial difficulties that threatened their social standing within the community. His father had confided to him during his last visit home that they might be forced to sell their plantation and relocate to less expensive circumstances. Timothy's testimony suggested that Mrs. Frost had been aware of his family's troubles, as she had made several pointed comments about the challenges facing tobacco farmers during their recent social interactions. The young man recalled feeling uncomfortable with her apparent knowledge of their private affairs, though he had attributed his unease to the natural sensitivity surrounding their financial situation. The testimony of Sarah Caldwell, a distant cousin who had survived the dinner party due to a last-minute illness that prevented her attendance, provided additional insight into Mrs. Frost's state of mind in the weeks preceding the event. Sarah recalled that Abigail had seemed unusually animated and purposeful during their final conversation, speaking with enthusiasm about her plans for the dinner party and her desire to express proper gratitude to those who had supported her during her period of mourning. Sarah noted that Mrs. Frost had made several cryptic comments about the importance of recognizing true friendship and the need to ensure that kindness was properly rewarded. At the time, these remarks had seemed like natural expressions of appreciation, but in retrospect, they carried implications that chilled Sarah to contemplate. Mrs. Frost had also mentioned her intention to prepare dishes that would be remembered long after the evening had ended, a statement that now seemed laden with sinister meaning. The collective weight of these testimonies painted a picture of a woman who had spent her years of widowhood carefully observing and cataloguing the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of those around her. Her apparent acts of kindness and community service had served as a facade that allowed her to gather information and position herself as a trusted figure within the social fabric of the valley, all while preparing for an act of revenge that would eliminate those she perceived as having wronged her or her late husband. The most revealing evidence in Clark Pemberton's investigation emerged from a concealed compartment discovered within Mrs. Frost's writing desk during the final search of her residence. Hidden behind a false panel, investigators found a collection of letters and personal documents that provided unprecedented insight into the widow's true motivations and the careful planning that had preceded the fatal dinner party. Among the most significant discoveries was a series of unsent letters addressed to each of the families who had attended the dinner. These documents, written in Mrs. Frost's characteristic flowing script, revealed a depth of resentment and calculated malice that contradicted everything the community had believed about her character. Each letter detailed specific grievances against the recipients, cataloguing perceived slights and injustices that had apparently festered in her mind during the years following her husband's death. The letter intended for the Ashford family accused them of deliberately undermining Thomas Frost's tobacco business through unfair competition and the spreading of malicious rumors about the quality of his crops. Mrs. Frost claimed that their actions had contributed to her husband's financial stress and declining health, ultimately hastening his death. She wrote with particular bitterness about social gatherings where she felt the Ashfords had deliberately excluded or humiliated her family, treating them as inferior despite their equal standing in the community. Her correspondence directed toward the Weatherby family revealed even deeper resentments. Mrs. Frost accused the mill owner of charging excessive rates for grain processing and of deliberately delaying services to the Frost farm during critical harvest periods. She claimed that these actions had forced her husband to seek alternative arrangements that proved both costly and unreliable. contributing to the financial difficulties that had plagued their final years together. The letter, meant for the Caldwell family, focused on their role as merchants and their alleged practice of extending credit to some families while demanding immediate payment from others. Mrs. Frost detailed instances where she believed her family had been treated unfairly in business dealings, forced to pay higher prices for goods while watching their neighbors receive more favorable terms. She interpreted these practices as deliberate attempts to maintain social hierarchies and exclude families like hers from full acceptance within the community's elite circles. Perhaps the most venomous correspondence was addressed to the Thornton family, whose patriarch had served as the valley's unofficial magistrate. Mrs. Frost accused him of bias in settling disputes and of consistently favoring the interests of wealthier families over those of more modest means. She claimed that his decisions in several property disputes had unfairly disadvantaged her husband and contributed to their social isolation within the community. The letters revealed that Mrs. Frost had maintained detailed records of every slight, every perceived injustice, and every instance where she felt her family had been treated as lesser members of the community. Her grievances extended back over a decade, suggesting that her resentment had been building long before her husband's death. The correspondence indicated that she viewed his passing not as a natural tragedy, but as the inevitable result of the stress and humiliation inflicted upon him by their neighbors. Treatment. Most disturbing was a personal journal discovered alongside the letters E, in which Mrs. Frost had documented her gradual transformation from grieving widow to calculating avenger. The entries revealed her growing obsession with her father's botanical knowledge and her recognition that his journals contained the means to exact perfect revenge upon those she held responsible for her suffering. The journal detailed her experiments with various plant preparations, initially conducted on small animals and later on sick livestock, brought to her attention by unsuspecting neighbors. She wrote with clinical detachment about observing the effects of different compounds, noting which combinations produced the most peaceful deaths and which allowed for the longest period of consciousness before the final transition. Her entries revealed a methodical approach to planning the dinner party, with careful consideration given to the menu, the seating arrangements, and the timing of each course. She had calculated the dosages required for each guest based on their approximate body weight and had prepared contingency plans to ensure that no one would survive to reveal what had transpired. The journal indicated that she had been planning the event for over a year, using social gatherings and casual conversations to gather the information necessary to execute her plan. The final entries in the journal revealed Mrs. Frost's intention to join her victims in death, viewing her own demise as the completion of a grand gesture of justice rather than suicide. She wrote about her anticipation of the peaceful transition that awaited her, describing it as a release from the burden of living among people who had never truly accepted or valued her family's contributions to the community. The discovery of this correspondence transformed the investigation from a search for external causes to an understanding of the psychological forces that had driven a seemingly ordinary woman to commit an act of unprecedented, calculated revenge. The letters and journal entries provided a window into a mind that had transformed grief and social resentment into a methodical plan for the elimination of those she perceived as her enemies. Dr. Margaret Whitmore closed the final page of Clark Pemberton's report as the autumn shadows lengthened across the Virginia Historical Society's reading room. The investigation had concluded in April 1811 with the decision that would shape how the tragedy was remembered, or rather deliberately forgotten, by the Blackwater Valley community and the broader region. The official determination, as recorded in Pemberton's final summary, attributed the deaths to a tragic accident involving the consumption of contaminated foodstuffs possibly resulting from the inadvertent inclusion of poisonous plant matter in the preparation of the evening meal. This conclusion, while technically acknowledging the botanical cause of the deaths, deliberately obscured the premeditated nature of Mrs. Frost's actions and the sophisticated knowledge that had made such a crime possible. The decision to suppress the true nature of the tragedy had been reached through consultation between county officials, prominent surviving family members, and religious leaders throughout the region. Their primary concern was preventing the spread of panic and protecting the reputation of the affected families, whose social and economic standing might have suffered if the full extent of Mrs. Frost's resentments became public knowledge. The revelation that their treatment of a neighbor had inspired such calculated revenge would have called into question the moral foundations of their community's social structure. Pemberton's private notes, discovered by Dr. Whitmore in a separate file, revealed his personal struggle with this decision. The clerk had recognized that suppressing the truth would prevent future communities from learning valuable lessons about the dangers of social exclusion and the potential consequences of accumulated resentments. However, he had ultimately yielded to pressure from influential families who argued that publicizing the details would serve no constructive purpose and might inspire similar acts of revenge in other communities. The physical evidence of the tragedy was systematically destroyed or concealed following the investigation's conclusion. Mrs. Frost's greenhouse was dismantled, and her botanical specimens were burned under official supervision. Her father's journals were confiscated and sealed away in county archives, where they remained until being transferred to the State Historical Society decades later. The farmhouse itself was abandoned and eventually demolished, with the land being absorbed into neighboring properties. The families affected by the tragedy adopted a collective silence regarding the events of February 28, 1811. Surviving relatives relocated to other regions or withdrew from public life, allowing the memory of the incident to fade from community consciousness within a generation. The few written records that mentioned the deaths referred only to the unfortunate accident at the Frost residence, perpetuating the official narrative while avoiding any discussion of the underlying circumstances. Dr. Whitmore's research revealed that this pattern of deliberate forgetting had been remarkably successful. References to the tragedy in subsequent historical documents were rare and invariably repeated the official explanation without questioning its accuracy. The sophisticated nature of Mrs. Frost's botanical knowledge and the premeditated character of her actions had been effectively erased from the historical record, leaving only vague mentions of a dinner party that had ended in multiple deaths due to accidental poisoning. The broader implications of the case had been similarly suppressed. The revelation that an apparently ordinary widow possessed knowledge capable of committing perfect murders had disturbing implications for community safety and the reliability of social appearances. Rather than confronting these uncomfortable truths, the authorities had chosen to treat the incident as an isolated anomaly that posed no ongoing threat to public welfare. Pemberton's final personal reflection, written months after the official investigation had concluded, expressed his concerns about the precedent established by their handling of the case. He worried that the decision to prioritize social stability over truth might encourage similar cover-ups in the future, potentially allowing dangerous individuals to escape detection and accountability. His fears proved prescient, as Dr. Whitmore's research had uncovered several similar incidents in other regions during the same period, all of which had been attributed to natural causes or accidents rather than deliberate action. The clerk's concluding observations noted that Mrs. Frost's case demonstrated the potential for ordinary individuals to acquire and employ knowledge that could pose significant threats to their communities. Her father's journals had contained information that was decades ahead of contemporary scientific understanding, suggesting that such dangerous knowledge might be more widespread than authorities realized. The systematic suppression of this information had prevented the development of safeguards or detection methods that might have prevented similar tragedies. As Dr. Whitmore prepared to leave the archives, she reflected on the broader lessons contained within Pemberton's meticulous documentation. The case of Abigail Frost revealed not only the capacity for calculated evil that could lurk beneath the surface of respectable society, but also the willingness of communities to sacrifice truth in favor of comfortable illusions. The widow's perfect crime had succeeded not only in eliminating her perceived enemies, but also in exposing the moral compromises that her neighbors were willing to make to preserve their sense of security and social order. The silence that had enveloped the Blackwater Valley tragedy for over a century served as a testament to the power of collective denial and the human tendency to suppress uncomfortable truths rather than confront the darker aspects of human nature that they revealed. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.